Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence spoke louder than words? A moment when someone was treated unfairly, yet no one dared to intervene? At Vincent's Grill, an upscale restaurant in the heart of Chicago, an ordinary evening turned into a profound lesson on dignity and respect. It all began when an elderly woman walked in, graceful, composed, yet seemingly unwelcome. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, with her elegant silver hair and a sophisticated gray wool coat, stepped confidently into the luxurious dining space. The shimmering chandeliers cast golden reflections onto glasses of deep red wine. Soft jazz melodies filled the air, and guests indulged in their conversations, basking in the warmth of a perfect evening. But as Mrs. Eleanor entered, a few glances lingered, not out of admiration, but for a reason no one dared to name. As she approached the reception desk, the hostess's smile seemed forced. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" The question carried no warmth, no genuine welcome. After glancing at the reservation list, the hostess led Mrs. Eleanor to a small table near the kitchen, a spot no guest would willingly choose in a fine dining establishment. Yet, Mrs. Eleanor didn't complain. She simply sat down, placed her handbag beside her, and quietly opened the menu. What she didn't know was that the injustice was far from over. And what no one else in the restaurant realized was that she wasn't alone. Mrs. Eleanor Carter sat quietly at her table, her eyes gliding over the menu in her hands. Though her demeanor remained calm, she couldn't ignore the obvious truth: she was being ignored. The moment she settled into her seat, a tall waiter named Jake passed by her table twice without stopping. At first, she assumed he was simply busy, but as she watched him swiftly attend to other tables, pouring water, taking orders within minutes, her suspicion grew. 3 minutes. 5 minutes, 10 minutes passed. She still had no water, no greeting, no acknowledgement. Meanwhile, a young couple who had just arrived were already sipping on their elegantly garnished cocktails, served with a warm smile from Jake. Finally, he stopped at her table, but instead of the professional courtesy he had shown others, his face betrayed a clear indifference. "Sorry for the wait," Jake said, though his tone lacked any real apology. "We're really busy tonight. Are you ready to order?" Mrs. Eleanor gently placed the menu down. Her eyes, warm yet piercing, met his. "Could I start with a glass of water first?" she asked calmly. Jake gave a dismissive nod. "I'll be right back." But right back stretched into an eternity. 15 minutes passed. Still, no water. Around her, other guests received their drinks, their meals, and the cheerful conversations of the waitstaff. Mrs. Eleanor remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the polished wooden table, as if she had experienced this many times before. She didn't need to ask why. She had lived long enough to understand. Nearby, a middle-aged woman nudged her husband, whispering something as her gaze flickered toward Mrs. Eleanor's table. A young man, caught up in lively conversation, briefly furrowed his brows as he noticed something felt off. Yet, no one said a word. In a restaurant filled with polite, well-mannered guests, discrimination was never loud or obvious. It was found in the subtle details, the averted glances, the longer than usual wait times, the lack of warmth in a welcome. And it was in these quiet moments that true character was revealed. What Jake didn't know was that he was being watched, and the one observing him was none other than the owner of the restaurant himself. Mrs. Eleanor Carter remained seated, saying nothing, yet her silence became the unspoken center of attention in the room. At a nearby table, a young couple exchanged glances. The wife frowned slightly, leaning toward her husband as she whispered, "Did you notice? She was here before us. But no one has served her yet." Her husband stole a glance at Mrs. Eleanor's table, then shrugged as he swirled the wine in his glass. "It's probably just a mistake." But was it really just a mistake? A few tables away, a group of office workers started to sense something was off. One woman lowered her wine glass, her eyes following Jake, the waiter, as he deliberately avoided Mrs. Eleanor's table. He laughed and joked with the guests next to her, pouring wine smoothly, enthusiastically recommending dishes. But as he passed Mrs. Eleanor's table, he didn't so much as glance in her direction. No one in the restaurant was overtly cruel. No one mocked her or insulted her. But they chose silence. At another table, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit slowly placed his fork and knife down. Turning to his companion, "Do you think this is strange?" he murmured. I don't believe this is a coincidence. His friend flicked a glance toward Mrs. Eleanor before shifting his gaze back to his plate. Yeah, but it's not our business. And just like that, another moment to speak up slipped away. But among the silent observers, one pair of eyes was watching closely. The eyes of a man seated at the corner of the bar. Dressed in a deep navy blue shirt, he held a glass of water. His gaze sharp, unwavering. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention to himself. But he saw everything. No one noticed him, but he noticed everyone. When Jake walked past Mrs. Eleanor once again without stopping, the man's fingers tapped lightly against the wooden bar. A slow, deliberate rhythm. He was not just another guest. He was Lucas Carter, the owner of Vincent's Grill. And the woman at table 14, the one being disregarded, was his mother. But Lucas didn't move, not yet. He wanted to see just how far Jake would take this. His patience had never been tested like this before. But tonight, beneath his calm demeanor, a storm was brewing. Lucas Carter sat quietly in the corner, his fingers tapping against the polished wooden bar, a steady rhythm that mirrored the rising storm within him. He had seen everything. From the moment his mother walked in, the hesitant look from the hostess, the way Jake deliberately avoided her, the hushed whispers of surrounding guests. They all noticed the injustice. Yet no one spoke up. Lucas was not a man who lost his temper easily. He had built Vincent's Grill from the ground up, turning it into one of the finest restaurants in Chicago. Every detail, from the curated menu to the elegant ambiance and impeccable service, was a reflection of his values: respect, fairness, and uncompromising quality. Yet, here he was, watching his own mother being treated as if she were invisible. Lucas tightened his grip around his glass. Jake had no idea who he was ignoring. And for that reason, Lucas decided to wait. He wanted to see how far Jake would take this when he believed no one was watching. By now, Mrs. Eleanor Carter had been sitting there for over 30 minutes. Her water never arrived. Her order never taken. The menu lay untouched before her. Yet no one had asked what she would like to eat. Meanwhile, a newly arrived table was already being served. Their drinks delivered with a warm smile. Their orders taken within minutes. Lucas studied Jake closely. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. Jake passed Mrs. Eleanor's table once more, his eyes deliberately avoiding her, his attention focused elsewhere. He laughed, poured wine, and leaned in with exaggerated politeness to suggest dishes for another table, his customer service mask flawless. That was the final straw. Lucas leaned forward slightly, catching the attention of Dana, the restaurant manager. Keep an eye on table 14. His voice was low, measured, yet ice cold. I want to see how Jake handles this. Dana hesitated for just a second, her gaze flickering toward Mrs. Eleanor before returning to Lucas. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when his anger was being held back by sheer force of will. She gave a slight nod and stepped away, not intervening yet. But watching closely, the restaurant buzzed with life, laughter and conversation flowing effortlessly. But a storm was about to break, and the only person unaware of it was Jake. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted, thick with an unspoken tension. Conversations continued, but there was an undeniable weight in the air. The more observant guests had already noticed the unmistakable injustice unfolding. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, still seated, still ignored, and in the corner, Lucas Carter remained watchful, waiting for the right moment. That moment had just arrived. As Jake once again passed by her table, Mrs. Eleanor calmly raised her hand, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "Excuse me, may I order now?" Jake halted, but his expression was anything but professional. He exhaled sharply, as if she had inconvenienced him, before turning to her with an impatient look. "We're really busy," he muttered curtly. "I'll come back later." And just like that, he turned away, not even giving her a chance to respond. Silence fell over the restaurant. Those who had been paying attention tightened their grips on their wine glasses, their utensils pausing midair, as if waiting for the inevitable. Then, Lucas stood up, not in a rush, not with anger, but with purpose. And yet, each step he took echoed like a drumbeat, drawing the attention of every single guest in the restaurant. Jake, oblivious at first, continued joking and chatting with another table. But when he caught sight of Lucas approaching, his smile faltered, the confidence drained from his face. "Lucas," I didn't know you were here tonight. Jake forced a grin, nervous, desperate. Lucas crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze ice cold. Oh, I've been here all night, watching. Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Mrs. Eleanor, who remained composed, sitting tall, her gaze calm yet commanding. Lucas tilted his head slightly, his voice dangerously steady. Explain, Jake. Explain why every other table was served immediately, yet this woman, who has been sitting here for over 30 minutes, hasn't even received a glass of water? Jake went pale. He stammered, struggling to find an excuse. I didn't mean to. I was just. Lucas cut him off instantly, his voice now as sharp as a blade. The woman you ignored. The woman you treated as if she didn't matter. He paused, long enough for every single person in the restaurant to hear and feel the weight of his words. She's my mother. Gasps spread across the room. The murmur of disbelief rippled through the guests. Eyes widened, forks clattered onto plates. Jake stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Lucas inhaled deeply, though the restrained fury in his eyes was undeniable. You don't need to explain anything else. His words were final, absolute. You're fired, effective immediately. Silence. Jake didn't argue, didn't beg. He simply removed his apron, dropped his gaze to the floor, and walked out, his head bowed under the weight of humiliation. Behind him, the stares of dozens of guests followed his exit, some filled with quiet satisfaction, others with open contempt. Lucas turned to Dana, the restaurant manager, his voice composed yet unwavering. Make sure my mother receives the best service possible. Immediately. Dana nodded furiously, then rushed toward Mrs. Eleanor, her face etched with regret. Lucas exhaled, trying to temper the storm within him. Finally, he turned to his mother. Mrs. Eleanor hadn't moved, still composed, still elegant, but in her eyes, a flicker of satisfaction, not because Jake had been fired, but because of how her son had handled it. But this story wasn't over yet. The biggest lesson was still to come. Vincent's grill slowly returned to its usual rhythm after Jake's firing. But the atmosphere had undeniably changed. There was no more boisterous laughter. No more guests pretending they hadn't seen what had just unfolded. They had witnessed something they could no longer ignore, an injustice laid bare. And the consequences that followed. Dana, the restaurant manager, hurried to Mrs. Eleanor Carter's table, her hands slightly trembling, not out of fear, but out of guilt, as she poured water into Mrs. Eleanor's glass. Her voice was laden with remorse. Mrs. Carter, I sincerely apologize for everything that happened, Dana said, her eyes filled with regret. This should have never happened. And I promise, it never will again. Mrs. Eleanor offered a gentle smile, nodding as if to ease Dana's anxiety. I understand, Dana, mistakes happen, but what truly matters is what we learn from them. At that moment, Lucas Carter returned to the table, taking a seat across from his mother. His anger had subsided, but the remnants of frustration still lingered in his sharp gaze. Are you okay? His voice was low, yet held a hint of concern. Mrs. Eleanor placed her hand gently on the table, her fingers resting lightly atop her son's. I'm fine, Lucas, and you handled everything well. Lucas sighed, his expression darkening. I should have acted sooner. His mother gave a subtle shake of her head, her voice calm yet filled with undeniable wisdom. No, you did the right thing. Sometimes, you must allow a person to reveal their true nature before confronting them. That way, there are no excuses, no justifications. Lucas held her gaze, considering her words, before finally nodding. Their personal moment may have ended, but the lesson remained, and not just for Jake. At a nearby table, the young couple who had observed the incident now spoke in hushed but animated voices. If the owner hadn't been here tonight, this whole thing would have been brushed aside like it never happened. The young woman murmured, her emotions still raw. Her partner nodded, thoughtful. The real question is, how many people like her have been treated this way, with no one standing up for them? Lucas overheard their conversation as he walked past. He said nothing, but their words stayed with him. Because they were right. His responsibility wasn't just to run a high-end restaurant. It was to ensure that everyone who stepped through those doors was treated with dignity and respect. That night, after the last guest had left and Vincent's grill officially closed, Lucas gathered his entire staff. He stood before them, his gaze sweeping across every single face in the room. What happened tonight wasn't just Jake's failure, he said, his voice steady yet firm. It was a wake-up call for all of us. The staff members held their breath, tension thick in the air. We don't just serve food, Lucas continued. We serve people, and every person who walks into this restaurant deserves respect. No exceptions. No one argued, because they knew he was right. Outside, through the glass windows of Vincent's grill, Mrs. Eleanor stepped into her car, taking one final glance back at the restaurant before departing. Her expression held no anger, no resentment, only a quiet sense of satisfaction. Because tonight was more than just a meal. It was a moment of change, one that would leave an imprint on everyone who had witnessed it. Mrs. Eleanor Carter didn't come to the restaurant that night seeking attention or stirring up controversy. She simply wanted a meal, like any other guest. But what unfolded became a powerful lesson for everyone who witnessed it. The injustice she endured wasn't loud or obvious. It was found in the small moments, the averted glances, the dismissive gestures, the seemingly innocent acts that carried a deeper meaning. Discrimination doesn't always need to be blatant to be dangerous. Because sometimes, silence itself is complicity. But this time, someone spoke up. Lucas Carter didn't just stand up for his mother, he stood up for something far greater. The belief that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. In the end, this story didn't just change Jake. It changed Vincent's grill, the way its guests saw the world. And, more importantly, it has the power to change how we all think about injustice.